Welcome to Trulyfit, the online fitness marketplace connecting pros and clients through unique fitness business software.
Danny Lennon, thanks for being here with the Trulyfit Podcast. I'm going to throw it right to you. Let's give a quick bio and background on who you are and tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Yeah, first, thanks so much for having me on the show. It's an absolute pleasure. For people who are unaware of me, my name is Danny Lennon. I run a company called Sigma Nutrition, which is aimed at putting out educational media content on evidence-based nutrition and health science. So that's primarily been done through the podcast Sigma Nutrition Radio, which has been running since 2014. And I've also been lucky enough to give quite a lot of lectures and present at conferences over those number of years, as well as work as a nutrition practitioner for a number of years too. So within Sigma, we also have an online coaching service, of which we have 4 coaching staff who work with a range of different clients. And yeah, it's been that goal of trying to put out evidence-based information in that area. I guess from an academic standpoint, before the company was back is a degree in nutritional sciences, and my undergraduate degrees in biology and physics. And so, yeah, ever since I completed my master's, I started coaching people, working as a nutrition practitioner, started creating content, and then over the past 7 or so years have kind of built Sigma Nutrition to where it is now. And yeah, that's a quick overview, but I'm happy to get into any specifics if we need to.
Well, I'm going to preemptively strike here on your behalf, and anybody who enjoys this conversation, episode 359 of Danny's podcast, which is Sigma Nutrition /podcast, is going to be a much more in-depth version of what this is. So if you enjoy this podcast, make sure you check out episode 359. So I'm going to lay the groundwork here and tell you why I chose this topic, which is calories in, calories out, law of thermodynamics as we know it in the training world as personal trainers. And I know that you spoke at Optima, so you understand National Academy of Sports Medicine. That's kind of the trainer's world, and then energy balance. So we're going to go into that and the landscape of just the states in general, how it works here, right? You have RDs, which you probably already know, registered dietitians, and then you have like a CNS, a certified nutrition specialist, and licensed nutritionists. They all have a background in their clinical and their master's degrees, and they work with people in that sort of setting. And then you have steps below that where it's sort of the wild, wild west, right? There's no real, it's a decentralized, unregulated market where you can go online and spend 2 hours and get some sort of certification, right? Or a degree where you call yourself a coach, a nutrition coach, and you give away information. So in the personal training world, we avoid that. It's kind of a no-no from National Academy of Sports Medicine to give advice, at least to give paid advice. But it's so interconnected in what we do, right? It's tough to work with a client whose goal is, hey, I have to lose weight, and you're working out with them, and then you go, well, I can't give you any nutrition advice. So there is a little bit of gray area where we do that, but the basis of our understanding is really just around what the certifications teach, which a lot of times, again, is just cals in and cals out. And obviously that does not tell everything. That does not give you the full spectrum of what's going on here. So I think at least using you to talk about some of those misconceptions and some of those things that tie into that to better help personal trainers or group fitness instructors with their clients is going to be, a light years change difference on how they approach things. So let's first throw it off to you. Can you give a general vague definition of energy balance, cals in, cals out, law of thermodynamics? Are those also 3 different ways to say the same thing, or are they different?
Yeah, I think like you say, there's oftentimes a misconception of what people are talking about when they use that phrase calories in, calories out, particularly when nowadays it's popular to see at least certain diet communities, I think, kind of bash the idea of calories in, calories out, or call it nonsense or whatever. And what they're really referring to is some other ideas, which we'll probably address later in this podcast. But as you say, energy balance equation and calories in, calories out, we are just looking at what is the difference between energy coming in to the system, and the system in this case being the human body, and the energy in is our caloric intake from foods. That's quite simple. And then calories out is our energy expenditure, which is made up of a number of components. That includes things like our resting metabolic rate, so just the calories we burn to essentially function and survive. We would have physical activity. Then we have this component called non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which are movements that happen throughout the day but aren't actual physical activity. So if you're fidgeting or just moving around as you're working at your desk, things like that still contribute some degree of energy expenditure. And then there's something called the thermic effect of feeding. So energy we expend to digest food. So all these components together would be our total energy expenditure. And essentially the difference between that calories in, calories out, or energy intake and energy expenditure can give us or it will describe the state of energy balance someone is in at that moment. So that just means, is there energy being stored within the system, or is there being energy released from the system, or is it being stable? And how this tends to manifest for our purposes when we're thinking about how to eat to, let's say, change body composition, is that as a general proxy, but not directly, and that's some of the nuance we'll get to, but as a general proxy, if we have a energy surplus, so more energy coming in, that is going to lead to a gain in body mass. If there is a net calorie deficit or less energy coming in that's being expended, there's going to be a loss of body mass. And when those are approximately equal, then someone is maintaining their weight. So really what we use is energy balance as a way, as a proxy measure for if there's likely to be changes in body composition, but it's not exactly predictive. And we'll come on to some examples. And particularly trainers will know this, that if someone is, let's say, dieting on a high protein diet versus on a very, very low protein diet, the calories might be the same, but the end result in terms of that person's body composition will be different. So it's not just calories that matter. However, what we can say is that, let's say someone's goal to lose body, then calorie deficit needs to be present. So if they're not in a calorie deficit, they cannot lose fat mass. If you're consuming more calories than you expend, no matter what the type of diet you are consuming and what foods are consumed within that, you do not lose fat mass. So we know there's some kind of requirements there for certain changes, but they're not exactly explanatory. So hopefully that makes some degree of sense to get us started, but we can definitely tease that apart and work through some of the nuance as we go here.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's a great definition. And I think, understanding that, from our side, the personal trainer side too, your clients are so very different. If you're dealing with a 22-year-old bodybuilder who's on 600 milligrams of testosterone, or a 59-year-old woman who's a secretary and sits down all day, there's other things that go into play, like I assume hormones and metabolism. How exactly does that factor into calories in, calories out?
Yeah, and this is a great point, because so often this is kind of painted as this false dichotomy of calories in, calories out on one hand, explaining body composition changes, and then other people saying, no, it's not calories, it's hormones. And in fact, it's both, right? It's not this dichotomy. They both work within each other. So hormones, of course, influence our body composition. You gave an example there. Especially if you have exogenous hormones like testosterone coming in, that changes your body composition. But even if people start talking about things like the role of insulin, let's say, sure, various hormones like insulin or leptin or ghrelin, these are like various appetite hormones or ones that signal our energy status. These can have a role in dictating how much food we might have a drive to consume, or they might have a role in a drive for us to expend more or less energy. So they definitely play a role, but they still are included within this framework of calories in, calories out. In other words, if they are impacting, let's say, someone's ability to lose body fat, it's because they're changing either energy intake or energy expenditure. So as an example, if eating in a certain way makes you hungrier and a greater drive to consume food, and then you consume more calories, yes, that's leading to weight gain, but still because there's an increase in energy intake. So there's a calorie surplus. Or the same if something causes someone to decrease their energy expenditure, that would lead to a change, but it's still within, it can still be explained by calories in, calories out. So it's not this dichotomy between two things, but you're right in saying that when we think about energy balance, it's not an exact prediction of what change there is in, say, fat tissue. What it's just describing is the amount of energy stored within our body. And that can be stored in the form of fat, but it can also be stored as carbohydrates going into our muscle as glycogen. It can be stored as new muscle tissue if we build that with protein. Like, that's a use of energy. So these can all play a part. So hormones, of course, play a role. No one is saying they are not important, but they don't discount the fact that these changes are still predicated mainly on energy balance. So in other words, if someone wants to lose fat mass, you cannot do that in a calorie surplus, no matter what changes in hormones you may do. And just as one maybe example that might be useful for people there is if you consider a ketogenic diet, which is very popular now, and it's kind of built on this idea of if you're on a ketogenic diet that keeps insulin levels really low, and then they'll talk about this idea of like insulin locking fat in fat cells. And so if you keep insulin low, you can release fat and burn fat, let's say. Well, if you eat enough calories, even on a ketogenic diet, you will not lose weight, and you can actually gain weight on a ketogenic diet. And this makes sense. I mean, there's people who want to be on a ketogenic diet, and let's say they want to gain some muscle mass, they want their body weight to go up, and we know that's possible. So just because we're manipulating a hormone, that doesn't override the fact that energy balance is going to be the primary driver of changes in, let's say, fat tissue over an extended period of time, if that makes sense.
Sure, that makes perfect sense. I think to lead into the next question, which is sort of a branch off of what you just said, is now meal timing. Does that timing of when you eat influence any of that in particular? So for example, if I had whatever it was, a 2,500 calorie diet, and it was broken up by the same ratios, let's say a 40-40-20, 40% carbohydrates, 40% protein, 20% fats. But the time in which I ate those meals 1 week as opposed to the next was much different. Maybe I eat my carbohydrates pre and post workout. Maybe I decided to eat most of my calories in the beginning and the end of the day and not in the middle. How does that affect this?
So from all the studies that we've seen so far where you completely match calorie and macronutrient intake, there doesn't seem to be, specifically for body composition, there doesn't seem to be a real difference between where in the day those may be consumed when you match intake and macronutrients. Now, that said, from a practical standpoint, if by changing your meal timing, that does have an influence on either your overall energy intake or your energy expenditure, then you would see a difference. So we could then kind of think through some thought experiments of where might that be the case. So that might be the case that if someone isn't tracking their food intake, let's say, and they decide to have a meal earlier in the day that has a significant amount of protein, does that impact their food choice during the day? But I think that one's pretty easy to explain because we're not matching for calories and macronutrients there. In cases where, let's say, someone tracks their food intake and it's the exact same, but all we're doing is changing the meal timing, is there going to be any real difference? It would have to change energy expenditure in some way in that case. So, I mean, we could think of some hypotheses. For example, if by moving a larger meal earlier in the day, let's say a few hours before you go train, by doing that, does that allow someone to expend a bit more energy during that training session? Maybe, maybe not. It's hard to know, at least for the average person, let's say, in the population. Now, we do have some interesting stuff in this area of chrononutrition where we see negative impacts, particularly on glycemic markers, so things like blood sugar and insulin, when a lot of calories, particularly from meals high in both carbohydrate and fat, are consumed at nighttime. And so we know there's a profound difference in the response and how we digest those meals, let's say at night versus during the day. So your blood sugar will have a greater spike and stay higher for longer for the exact same meal if that's eaten at what we call biological night. So there might be a basis there for some people, particularly looking at blood glucose control, of not wanting to have very large meals high in carbohydrate and fat close to the onset of sleep or towards the end of the day. And they might find a benefit to putting some of that earlier in the day. And then there's some associational stuff with people who do tend to distribute a higher percentage of their calories to the earlier part of the day, tends to kind of correlate with lower levels of body fat overall, but there may be some things that might explain that. So overall, what we can say at the moment is if your food intake in terms of calories and macronutrients you consume are the exact same, then probably meal timing isn't going to make a major difference to body composition. But as I said, it could make some differences for things like glycemic control, or for people who are not tracking their food, by changing when you consume meals may impact the amount you eat overall. So therefore, if let's say when people do intermittent fasting and they shrink their feeding window, that's changing their timing. But if that leads them eating less calories, then that of course will impact their body composition. So it can play a role indirectly, but directly when we match it, there's probably not much difference. So the good news there is that we can kind of use that to our advantage and kind of base it around the preferences of that individual.
Is one of the indirect characteristics of that would be the sort of the thermic effect, meaning if you were somebody who's eating those calories throughout the day, let's say you divide it up into 9 meals as opposed to 1 meal, right? Is that thermic effect of your body trying to burn those calories or use those calories in a particular way, aiding in this cals in, cals out law of thermodynamics situation?
So that was one idea that had been proposed quite a number of years ago, but subsequent studies seem to show that actually the meal frequency doesn't play any role in increasing metabolic rate. So whilst, yes, and let's say, and I think some of the studies, for example, would have compared 3 large meals to 6 smaller meals. So the intake over the day was the same, but it was either in a 3 or 6 meal distribution. So small, frequent meals, with this idea of keeping the metabolism revved up is kind of colloquial terms people may have heard. But it seems that it doesn't make any real difference. So yes, you're having more of these meals, but because there are a smaller number of calories in each meal, you're getting the same total thermic effect of feeding across the day, because it's just relative to the amount of food that you're digesting. So again, there's good news there from a practical standpoint, that if you are working with a client, you don't need to have them consume little and often throughout the day. You can go with what their preference is. Some clients will actually prefer small, frequent meals. Some might prefer bigger meals, but less frequently. So that 3 bigger meals, and another client will have 3 small meals and say 3 snacks. And again, if the total intake is the same across the day, it won't have any impact. So you can kind of go with whatever meal frequency works best from that perspective.
Wow, well, that's good information. I would have always assumed that eating those small frequent meals was advantageous, but that's good to know. The studies have sort of proved otherwise. Speaking to that preference, right? Whether you decide to eat your calories in 9 meals or 2 meals or 3 meals, that sometimes speaks to how hungry you are. And I know that that's a way in which people control their diets or try to help their clients control their diets through feeling satiated, right? Satiety. So I know there's a few different ways to do that. Do you recommend that? And if so, how exactly are I guess you would say the most beneficial, healthy ways to go about doing that?
Yeah, this is a great question, because I think from a practical coaching perspective, we have to realize that, we're not going to have most people track their food intake or log their calories, and we wouldn't want to either. For most people, it's probably impractical, definitely in the long term. And ideally, even if someone starts doing that, the goal would be to move away into a more sustainable way of eating. And so with some general food changes, we can lead to greater levels of satiety or this feeling of fullness over the course of the day, which then may lead to a reduction in caloric intake within those individuals. So this will be good for either someone who's just trying to control their level of calories to kind of maintain where they're at. It also can be used in the case of someone actually wants to lose body, wants to diet. By making some of these changes, it can have a knock-on effect of making them consume less. So a few basic ones to start is, we know protein has a high satiety impact. So having an overall relatively high protein diet, so in other words, at each of their main meals, do we have a good source of protein? So this could be for someone who consumes an omnivorous diet. It could be a piece of chicken or meat, some eggs, or some dairy, or even supplemental whey protein. For someone who's on a plant-based diet, you could use plant sources like tofu, beans, peas, etc., and that you're having high protein serving at each meal. The next component would be a high fiber intake. We know that fiber has immediately has this impact on satiation, so it makes someone feels full, but also that can continue over the longer term, across many hours, let's say. And what fiber also does is, because it slows what we call the transit time of food through the gut, so it takes longer to digest, can keep that feeling of fullness for a bit longer. The other good thing about foods that tend to be high in fiber is that they have a low calorie density. So calorie density would be how much calories is in we can look at either a certain mass of food or a certain serving of food. There's different ways to view it. But essentially, if we think of things with a very low calorie density, let's say if you take lots of fibrous vegetables, they're a good example here, that on your plate, they would fill up a huge volume of food, but for a very small calorie value. The opposite of something that has a high calorie density would be, let's say, something like oil. You could have a spoon of oil that might be close to 100 calories, but it's taking up a very small volume when someone consumes that. So by having some low calorie density foods and meals, this can be also a way to increase that satiety and fullness without contributing too many calories. So if you think of things like very large salads, or something like soups or water-based dishes, because they're essentially filling up a bigger volume with a large contribution from water, which has no calories. So that would be another useful way to go. So protein, fiber, and then foods of a low calorie density are probably the three primary ways to go. And then there's some other areas that kind of look at if you consume, say, protein first in a meal, or if you consume fiber first. But the main ones that I discussed is getting a high protein intake, getting an adequate amount of fiber and some high fiber meals, and then focusing on some of those low calorie density meals. So things like water-based meals, fruits, vegetables, and so on.
That's great information. So I want to shift gears here and talk a little bit about calorie deficit. So the bro science behind calorie deficit is that if you're in it, you can't build muscle. So you have a sort of a two-sided approach. You either, you're in your bulk stages, right, as they say, where I'm eating to grow, and then I'm cutting down when I'm trying to, shape some of the fat off. But it's very rarely, not saying that that's a healthy thing, not saying that I recommend that, but that is a groupthink idea that goes around in the sort of like the online communities. Can you speak to being in a calorie deficit, but still being able to maintain, I guess you would say, an athletic muscular build?
Yeah, sure. So I think that idea that you discuss comes around because we know if someone wants to maximize the amount of muscle they're going to grow in a set period of time, then the best conditions for that would be a calorie surplus, so more energy coming in, so a classic gaining phase. So if I were to say to you, over the next 3 months, let's gain as much muscle as possible, you would go into a surplus. However, the question of if you're in a calorie deficit, so in other words, the opposite, so you're dieting, you're losing body weight and losing body fat, does that mean you are definitely going to lose muscle mass? And then the second question, is it maybe even possible to gain some muscle mass whilst in this calorie deficit? So the first question, whether it's how likely it is you can just maintain that muscle even as you're in a deficit and losing weight and losing fat, then that is entirely possible virtually for everyone. Now, there's some circumstances which we could discuss. For example, if you have someone who's already incredibly lean and is dieting into a bodybuilding show where they're doing a 6-month contest prep diet and they're already very lean, then yeah, towards the tail end of that, no matter their best efforts, there's going to be some loss of lean body tissue. However, that's not what most people are doing. So most people who are trying to diet down and who have a relatively decent amount of body fat that they can diet off, then it's entirely possible to maintain their muscle mass simply by giving, number one, a stimulus to that muscle tissue in the form of resistance training. So that's going to be your most potent thing to hold on to muscles. And then second, supporting that with an appropriate high amount of protein. So if you have, let's say, 3 to 4 high protein meals across the day in combination with resistance training, then you're going to basically be able to maintain your muscle mass as you diet for the vast majority of people. Like I said, if we leave aside something like a bodybuilder in contest prep, and even beyond that, if there was a tiny percentage of loss of muscle tissue, it'd be so small as it would be unnoticeable. And because tissue is so easy to gain back, that once you've lost it, it's much easier than building it in the first place. It would come back as very quickly after going back into maintenance calories. So it's certainly possible to maintain that. The second question of, well, in a calorie deficit, can you build muscle? Then the answer to that is also yes. And you can see this in a ton of studies, like just literally across the board, where people are in a relatively slight calorie deficit. So nothing major. In some cases, there are some big deficits, but across the board, if it's just a relatively modest calorie deficit, you tend to see this recomposition effect in a lot of studies where there's, in combination with a loss of fat mass, there's also a gain in muscle tissue. Now, where this is most likely to happen depends on the individual. There's a number of different components here. So if we take someone who is relatively new to resistance training, then it's actually incredibly likely they're going to gain muscle mass even as they're in a calorie deficit. And most trainers will have probably seen this, right? You take on a new client, you start training them. Their goal is to lose body fat. So they've changed their diet, they're training and being more active. Their weight is coming off, they're losing weight, but because they've picked up a barbell for the first time in their life, they're actually gaining muscle tissue as well. So they have this complete change in their body composition. And this is just the norm basically in people who are new to resistance training. So the earlier someone is in their training career, let's say, or the less experience they have with resistance training, then it's much more likely they're going to have this effect, or the much more profound effect of gaining muscle. Second would be someone who has previously had that muscle tissue and lost it, but now to regain it back. So there was one particular study, Tom Longland was the lead author, where they took college athletes, I think they were football players in the States, and they had came back after kind of a summer off where guys hadn't been training, probably just had been partying or whatever. And they had come back off a layoff of not training basically. And they put them in a 40% calorie deficit in this study, which is pretty significant, probably a bigger deficit than most people would diet. And they saw in these guys who like 22-year-old guys, athletes, even they were able to gain muscle. Now, the caveat there is that they were gaining back the muscles that they previously had and they kind of lost in that kind of period off. So if it's something like returning from injury, someone new to resistance training, or the calorie deficit is very small, then for a lot of people, and a lot of the people that coaches will be typically training, then it's possible to see some gain in muscle tissue. And then the caveat here is you're not going to see the same degree as if you were eating more calories and in a surplus. So it's not maximizing muscle gain, but it is possible for those people. Where it's not going to happen is likely in people who are closer to their genetic ceiling, let's say for muscle tissue, guys that have been training a long period of time, where even going in a surplus and doing everything right, gains are going to be very, very slow. It's not really plausible to think, yeah, you're going to see any appreciable gain in muscle mass whilst dieting. And that's where you do see those cycles back and forth between purposeful gaining and dieting phases. But for the average person in the population, and particularly beginners, then it's entirely possible for that to happen.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I think a lot of this conversation seems to, basically, in summation, this is very esoteric. There's a lot of layers to this, and you have to understand that each person is going to be treated a little bit differently based on everything from the hormones to the calories to what's going on to have they previously built up muscle, as opposed to, are they beginners? Are they closer to 65 or 25, right? All of these things factor in. Of course, the baseline floor of this has to be a cals in, cals out approach, right? That's always involved in it. But all of those things that sort of interweave with it, right? That make it that one strong belt loop is need to be addressed also, right? You're not going to do the same things.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because I think what's important to make clear here is when we say that, say, energy balance or calories in, calories out is like this fundamental thing that goes across the board, which it is. All that is saying is that calories in, calories out, the difference between those is kind of will explain something about what's happening, but it's not talking about any prescription of a dietary intervention. What I haven't said is that calories in, calories out means someone needs to track their calories or count calories. That's not what we said. It's not to say that simply telling someone to eat less calories is the intervention you go with. It's none of these things. We haven't said anything about a type of diet or what strategy to use. We've just said if someone is going to lose body fat, then no matter what they do, they're going to have to be in a calorie deficit. That doesn't mean they have to count calories, though. They could do some of the basic changes we mentioned. Maybe they just change their food quality. They end up eating less calories. Someone else likes to do fasting, so they do that. They're eating less calories. Someone else decides to track their intake. So there's all these different strategies that still fit within being explained by energy balance, but none of them are an intervention. Calories in, calories out is not a diet. It is not an intervention. So we're not saying this is the way to prescribe to everyone. And so to your point, yeah, depending on what that individual's requirement is, you would approach that very differently in terms of how you would set out the actual type of strategy you want to give and the type of advice you want to give to that individual.
Now, sleep. How does sleep sort of play into this? And then I guess I'll break this down to two parts: sleep from a general macro perspective, and then sleep from an individual's perspective. So let me give you two kind of examples to put this into play here. So it could be, John is 45. He sleeps 5.5 hours of night because he's got a kid and he's just got a busy job, right? And then, Jill gets 8 hours a night of sleep, right? How is her energy expenditure maybe different based upon the sleep? And then also, those are two different people. What about the same person, right? So if Danny is having a really good week of sleep because everything is going right, as opposed to a really bad week of sleep, should that be manipulated in some way?
Yeah, great question. So I think comparing between individuals, it's probably worth acknowledging that there's always going to be an inter-individual variation. So in other words, how susceptible someone is to getting a bit less sleep and the impact that has will vary from one person to the next. Just genetic differences. Someone actually may do better at like 7 hours per night. Someone else would do best, like theoretically, let's say at 8, or when someone gets only 4 hours a night, the impact that has on their mood or their activity the next day can be different from person to person. So there's always this variation that's going to occur, but there are, of course, generalities. So probably the bigger question for people is then, okay, for me as an individual, if I don't get an appropriate amount of sleep or good quality sleep, what impact does this have on overall energy balance? Well, in terms of energy expenditure, interestingly, if someone is getting less sleep because they're awake longer, theoretically, that would increase their energy expenditure because they're just simply awake. However, there's these knock-on consequences that have impacts on our behavior that are likely going to have a negative impact. So from a diet perspective, for example, we know that with even a couple of days of sleep restriction, so moving someone down to, let's say, 4 hours of sleep a night for even 2 to 3 days in some of these studies, has pronounced impacts on various different hormones like ghrelin, which is our appetite hormone. So the higher that is, the greater your appetite. Another hormone called leptin. And when you see these decreases in leptin, it basically signals to the body to do two things: go consume more food and move around a bit less. And it's also, we've seen kind of big changes in subjective reports from those individuals of their hunger levels, and also their hunger for specifically palatable foods tends to go up. So if we know then that because someone is sleep restricted over the course of a couple of days, then despite their best efforts and what they may have planned with their diet, they're now waking up in a position where over the course of this day, they're likely to have higher hunger levels. They're likely to have a decreased drive to go and be physically active, even without realizing it. And then their preference for foods may change based on that sleep restriction. And I'm sure people can think of maybe examples in themselves of where when you're really tired, that influences your motivation to either move or able to the food choices you may make. But it's also happening on a subconscious level without realizing. So sleep restriction plays a role there. And obviously we know if people are sleep restricted, not only does it change that kind of drive to go and be physically active throughout the day, but it's also going to impact your physical activity quality as well. If you're actually doing exercise or a training session or so on, the amount of workload you can tolerate is going to be different. And it's also going to impact your recovery from that. So you're going to have less or poorer recovery from that exercise, which then obviously bleeds into your follow-up training sessions over the course of the week. And if you have a really kind of prolonged chronic sleep restriction, you're probably increasing like risk of things like illness or injury. Now, the thing here that's important is probably not for people to freak out and worry about having one bad night of sleep. Humans are pretty resilient, and one bad night is not going to cause absolute mayhem to the point of like your health is going to deteriorate and everything's going to fall apart. And I think everyone who has even competed in sport or just enjoyed going to the gym has noticed anecdotally there have been times where they got a really bad night of sleep, but they went training and actually had a good session. So that's goes to show like one night sleep is not the thing to worry about. What you're worried about is on average, what is your typical habitual sleep quality and sleep quantity like, and what are your habits around sleep like. So if it's kind of all over the place, sleeping at random times, being on your phone or your tablet until all hours of the morning until you fall asleep, getting like 4 hours a night consistently, especially if it's in cases where you have control to change that, then there are things definitely to work on. If it's things where it can't be changed, so let's say you gave a good example of someone that has a young kid at home, and for those moments, like that's okay. That just has to be something that has to be taken on board and can explain how can I plan around this, but it's still going to happen. But in cases where people can modify some behaviors, I think there's a clear example where sleep is going to impact behaviors related to exercise, activity levels generally, food intake, which impact energy in, energy out. And then beyond that, obviously things like mood and so on. So that's kind of an overview of how it might play a role here.
Yeah, that's fantastic information. And I think for the trainers out there, it's important that you just sort of keep this upfront in consciousness. I think it's very normal in everyday conversation. I wouldn't be surprised if it happened 5 days a week, not even just with clients, with friends and family who come up to you and say, I didn't sleep well last night. But because it's said so often, you take it for granted, for lack of a better term, right? You don't factor that into anything. You're like, oh, you didn't sleep well. No big deal. Who does sleep well, right? But it's an issue because, like you said, there are all of these other physiological things that play into it. It's not just my one anecdotal experience. It's that the leptin and the ghrelin and all these other things going on in your body, maybe sort of subconsciously telling you you're low on energy. Let's go eat dense calories. And all of those factors that play into it. And I think from the perspective of both the individual, but more so when you're working with someone, I think that I pay attention to myself when I'm on lack of sleep. But when someone tells me they haven't slept well, do I then, pivot and provide them with appropriate exercises? Do I then say, you know what, this is going to be a light day. Today, we're going to do dynamic stretching. We're going to hit the treadmill. We're going to do abs. We're not going to do this very heavy workout I had planned for you, doing 5 and 6 reps at 70% of your max weights, because you don't have that in you today.
Right. Yeah. And that's a fantastic point. And I think that's where this stuff is really comes into like the art of coaching, that you're not dealing with robots where we can say on your first consult with someone, this is the way I want you to sleep all the time, and you're going to have 8 hours perfectly every night. No, it's about understanding what happens with poor sleep, building some habits where we can with them, but then being able to be flexible, like you say, of when someone does report that their sleep is being diminished for the last couple of days and they're coming into the gym, then yeah, maybe we don't hammer them with that really intense session we have now, and we move to something that is going to be productive, good quality work that they're going to be able to tolerate well, still recover with. And then when they're back again with you in 2 days' time for their next training session, they'll be ready to train properly, as opposed to hammering them now and they either can't get through the workout or it's just so taxing that it's going to take 4 days for them to recover fully again. So yeah, that's a fantastic point, that use this information to guide your judgment and kind of trust your own judgment to make these decisions, as opposed to thinking of these things as just like abstract, cool pieces of information.
Yeah. And I always shamelessly plug my book at least once a podcast, Fitness Business 101. I have a section in there. When you're working with your client, the most important thing to do is the update phase. When they come in, casual conversation, ask them about their day, ask them what's been going on. So you get this feedback, which is not just conversation. It's you then being able to pivot and adjust and modify your workout, right? If your client says, feeling great, been eating great all day, and your plan was just to have a light session, well, maybe you need to pivot. Maybe today is the day you need to do legs because they hate legs, but they're in a good mood today, right? So you've now switched your session, and vice versa. They come in, they're on 4 hours of sleep, their toddler was up all night. You have to be able to switch that, but you can't do that unless you get that update, right? So even if you have a general blanket plan of what you want to do for the day, you should be able to handle those curveballs and get ready to ask those questions, get the information back, and then pick your path with your client.
Yeah, fantastic point. Yeah, completely echo all of that.
So let's plug your stuff, Danny. Let's let the audience and the listeners know where they can find you.
Sure. So if people like listening to podcasts and they like nerding out on details of nutrition science, then it's just Sigma Nutrition Radio on any podcast app of their choosing. If they want to look at any of our written content, that's over at sigmanutrition.com. So there they'll see a tab for our Sigma statements, which are basically long form written pieces on controversial or hot topics within nutrition. And we kind of give an overview of the evidence-based position on that, and hopefully kind of clear up a lot of confusing topics. And then if they're looking for me on social media, probably the best place is Instagram. I'm Danny Lennon _Sigma, or if people prefer Twitter, I'm Nutrition Danny. So any of those places, I'm happy to take questions or feedback.
Well, I'm a fan of the podcast, and I will tell the personal trainers, group fitness instructors, fitness teachers, you're doing yourself a disservice to your clients if you're not listening to Danny's podcast, because you're going to get a lot of really good information, again, in areas that are not exactly in our wheelhouse, that you can combine with what we do best to help your clients. So give them a listen. And Danny, thank you very much. Hope we talk soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great conversation. Really enjoyed it.